The ballroom of the Carlisle estate shimmered with 1,000,000 stars, each one a diamond catching the light, an echo of the billion-dollar empire built by Ethan Carlisle. He stood at the center of it all, a man who had everything, including a wife who was little more than a beautiful accessory. Tonight, on their 10th anniversary, he planned to make it official, to finally and publicly expose the secret he believed made her unworthy of his name. But he failed to account for a single, unassuming figure who would walk through the gilded doors, a man whose arrival would not only shatter Ethan's carefully constructed world, but reveal a truth so profound it would make his entire fortune look like a child's allowance. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a cold, hard lesson in what it means to be truly wealthy. The air inside the Carlisle Hall was thick with the scent of white roses and old money. Chandeliers, each a cascade of crystal and light, hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant glow on the hundreds of guests who moved through the vast space with practiced ease. This was more than a party. It was a testament to the power and prestige of Ethan Carlisle. At 45, he was a titan of finance, a self-made man who had turned a small investment firm into a global powerhouse. His success was his identity, and he wore it like a tailored suit, perfectly arrogantly, and without a single wrinkle. He stood by the marble bar, a flute of champagne in his hand, his gaze sweeping the room. He nodded to Vincent Caldwell, a senior partner in his firm, and exchanged a few clipped words with Bridget Montgomery, a well-known socialite whose gossip column was the lifeblood of their circle. Ethan's smile was a professional tool, a flash of teeth that promised affability, but revealed nothing of the cold calculus that governed his mind. Tonight it was all for show. The grand stage was set for their 10th wedding anniversary, and in his mind it was the final act of a performance he had grown to despise. His wife Genevieve was the main attraction tonight, and Ethan felt a familiar surge of resentment as he watched her. She was a vision in a midnight blue silk gown, simple yet elegant, its clean lines belying the immense cost. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the graceful curve of her neck, and a single string of pearls, a gift from him, sat at her throat. Genevieve moved through the crowd with a quiet grace, her laughter a soft, melodious sound that seemed almost out of place amidst the sharp, brittle chatter of the elite. She spoke to everyone with the same genuine warmth, from the powerful CEO of a tech giant to the young caterer who had just started her job. Ethan's lips thinned. That was the problem with Genevieve. She was an anomaly. She didn't fit. He had met her a decade ago, a beautiful, unassuming young woman working at a small, independent art gallery. He had been enchanted by her sincerity, her lack of pretense, a refreshing contrast to the women who swarmed him. He had convinced himself she was different, that her simple nature was a blank canvas he could mold into the perfect society wife. He had proposed after only 3 months, a whirlwind romance that had left his friends and family reeling. But the years had passed, and the enchantment had faded, replaced by a deep-seated frustration. He had tried everything. He had bought her designer clothes, hired the best stylists and social coaches, and introduced her to his world. Yet she remained Genevieve. She still spent her afternoons volunteering at a community center for children. She still preferred a quiet evening reading to a raucous gala. She still spoke of her family. Her father, a seemingly unremarkable man named Patrick O'Connor, and her late mother with a reverence that Ethan found baffling and embarrassing. Her humble origins, once a charming novelty, had become a source of profound shame for him. He had built his empire on sharp deals and ruthless efficiency. Every aspect of his life was a testament to his ambition, his vision. But Genevieve was a living, breathing symbol of his one great miscalculation. She was a flaw in his otherwise flawless existence, a reminder of a romantic folly he now deeply regretted. And tonight, he would put an end to it. Vincent Caldwell approached him, a man whose loyalty Ethan had bought and whose opinion he valued. "The party is a roaring success, Ethan, a testament to your impeccable taste." "Thank you, Vincent," Ethan replied, his eyes still fixed on his wife. "It's about to get even more interesting." Vincent followed his gaze to Genevieve, a puzzled expression on his face. "Genevieve looks stunning tonight. She's so genuine, a rare commodity in this crowd." Ethan snorted softly, a sound that was half laugh, half contempt. "Genuine or naive? She's the daughter of a man who lives in a glorified shed in the woods, Vincent. I built this empire with grit and cunning. She comes from a world of sentimentality and hand-me-downs. We are two different species." Vincent's face tightened. "That's a bit harsh, isn't it? She's an incredible woman." "She is a liability," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "She's a testament to the fact that you can't buy class, and you certainly can't manufacture it. The longer she's by my side, the more people whisper about her simple background, about the charming pauper who married the king. I'm a man who deals in perception, Vincent, and her presence, her ordinariness, is a chink in my armor." He took a long sip of his champagne, the cold liquid doing little to soothe the fire of his frustration. He had put on a good front for a decade, but the charade was wearing thin. He had planned this evening meticulously. The speeches, the toasts, the grand declarations, they were all a prelude to the moment he would finally, publicly, and irreversibly detach himself from the woman who had become a symbol of his greatest failure. Genevieve, unaware of the storm brewing in her husband's mind, was now speaking with Bridget Montgomery. Bridget, with her hawk-like gaze and predatory smile, was a master of a different kind of commerce, the trade of secrets and insecurities. Genevieve was smiling, but Ethan could see the subtle strain around her eyes. He knew Bridget was probably prying, asking about her family, her past, all the things that Ethan had tried to bury. He watched as Genevieve answered with quiet dignity, refusing to be baited. His resentment flared. How could she not understand? How could she still hold on to the relics of a life that he had given her, the chance to escape? He had given her wealth, status, a world she could never have imagined. He had transformed her from a girl in a second-hand dress to the wife of one of the most powerful men in the country, and yet she had refused to let go of her humble roots, treating her past not as something to be escaped, but as a cherished part of who she was. It was a silent act of defiance he could no longer tolerate. The hour was approaching. The orchestra had shifted to a more subdued classical melody. The guests had gathered in the main ballroom, their anticipation palpable. Ethan put down his empty glass. He felt a quiet, simmering resolve. Tonight, the whispers would stop. The questions would cease. He would make sure of it. He would expose the truth not just to the world, but to Genevieve herself, a final act of liberation for them both. He would show her that the life he had given her was a gilded cage, and that the key to true freedom was to leave behind the sentimentality of the past and embrace the cold, hard reality of his world. He straightened his tie, a confident, predatory glint in his eyes. The show was about to begin. The crowd settled, a hush falling over the glittering ballroom as Ethan made his way to the podium. Genevieve had been asked to join him, and she stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a picture of grace and wifely devotion. Ethan felt the warmth of her touch, but it was a heat he had long grown numb to. He looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of business rivals, social peers, and a smattering of curious journalists. He had their attention. "Good evening, everyone," Ethan began, his voice amplified by the microphone, commanding and smooth. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate a significant milestone, 10 years of marriage. 10 years. He paused, letting the number hang in the air, a testament to his supposed commitment. And what a decade it has been. He turned to Genevieve, and a ripple of sentimental murmurs went through the crowd. Genevieve's smile was genuine, her eyes shining with emotion. She was truly happy, truly in love with the man she believed was her partner. It was this simple, unshakable faith in him that fueled Ethan's contempt. It was a naivete he found pathetic. 10 years ago, he continued, I met a woman who was a complete paradox. She was everything I wasn't, quiet, unassuming, with a complete lack of ambition. She worked in an art gallery, a place where people trade in sentimentality and subjective value. I, as you know, trade in cold, hard numbers and indisputable facts. The crowd chuckled, a few knowing glances exchanged. Genevieve's smile faltered slightly. She squeezed his arm, a gentle, silent plea. Ethan ignored it. This was his stage, and he was the star. I saw her as a kind of a project. I thought I could introduce her to my world, that I could give her the life she never knew she wanted. I brought her out of the quiet, unremarkable town she came from, and into this world of prestige and power. His voice dripped with condescension. I gave her a name, a home, a wardrobe full of clothes that cost more than her father's entire year's salary. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder this time, with a note of unease. Genevieve's hand had dropped from his arm. Her face, which had been so full of light moments before, was now pale, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. I tried to make her into a society woman, he continued, his tone turning openly mocking. I hired the best tutors to teach her table manners, to help her select wine, to learn the difference between a Monet and a Manet. She tried, bless her heart. She truly did. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. But some things are just ingrained, aren't they? You can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Bridget Montgomery leaned over to her friend, her eyes gleaming with vindictive delight. Vincent Caldwell's face was a mask of shock and disgust. He had known Ethan was a man of little sentiment, but this was beyond the pale. I have spent a decade building a life for us, a life of unparalleled luxury and influence, Ethan said, his voice rising in volume and arrogance. But you see, while I was building empires, Genevieve was, well, she was still dreaming of her father's little farm. She still talks about her mother's vegetable garden and the simple joys of a life I worked so hard to escape. And tonight, I have to be honest with myself and with all of you. My beautiful wife is an artifact from a past I've long outgrown. She is the living, breathing reminder of a sentimental mistake I made 10 years ago. Tears had welled in Genevieve's eyes, but she held them back with an almost superhuman effort. Her jaw was clenched, and she stood straight, a warrior facing an impossible foe. The silence that followed Ethan's words was deafening, a vacuum created by 100+ people holding their breath. Ethan looked at her, expecting to see a broken woman. Instead, he saw a glimmer of steel in her tear-filled eyes. So to my beautiful, my wonderfully simple wife, he said, holding up his glass in a mockery of a toast. Thank you for the 10 years. You have taught me a very valuable lesson that there are some things, some people that no amount of money can ever truly change. He drank from the glass, his eyes fixed on her. The public shaming was complete. The crowd was a blur of horrified, pitying, and even gloating expressions. He had done it. He had freed himself. He was ready to announce their separation, to issue a cold, professional statement that their 10-year experiment had come to an end. Genevieve took a deep, shuddering breath. The spotlight was on her, a harsh, unforgiving glare. The world was watching her crumble. Her humiliation was complete. But just as she was about to turn and walk away, to find a dark corner to hide in, a new voice cut through the stunned silence. It wasn't loud, but it had an authority that commanded attention, a quiet resonance that made Ethan's brash pronouncements seem like the bluster of a child. "I believe I must apologize for my tardiness," the voice said, and every head in the room turned toward the entrance of the ballroom. A man stood there completely out of place amidst the black tie finery. He wore a simple, well-worn tweed jacket and a pair of trousers that looked a decade old. His face was a map of lines and character, his grey hair a bit disheveled. He was of average height and build, his hands calloused. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, a man from a world utterly alien to the one they inhabited. It was Genevieve's father, Patrick O'Connor. A wave of mortification washed over Ethan. This was the final ironic nail in the coffin of his perfect evening. The very man he had just publicly mocked had arrived, a physical manifestation of everything he had just disparaged. He was the rustic farmer, the simple country bumpkin, the walking embodiment of Genevieve's humble, embarrassing past. Patrick O'Connor walked slowly, deliberately into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on his daughter. A soft, pained expression crossed his face as he saw her tear-streaked cheeks. Then his gaze shifted, and it landed on Ethan. And in his eyes there was no anger, no rage, only a deep, profound sense of disappointment. A disappointment that cut Ethan to the bone more effectively than any insult could have. The game had just changed. The grand ballroom moments before a stage for a public spectacle now felt like a holding cell for 100+ stunned onlookers. The air, once filled with the cloying scent of roses, was now heavy with an unspoken question. Who was this man? And why had he appeared at the exact moment of peak drama? Patrick O'Connor continued his slow, measured walk toward the podium. He didn't rush. He didn't make a scene. His presence was a quiet, steady force, a complete contrast to the manic energy Ethan had just radiated. He moved past the hushed and confused guests, his gaze fixed on Genevieve. He took her hand in his, a large, strong hand, with a few scars and calluses that spoke of a life lived with purpose. Genevieve, her face a mixture of shock and relief, clung to him, her composure finally beginning to crack. "Genevieve, my dear," Patrick said, his voice a gentle, low rumble. "I am so sorry I'm late. I got the time zone wrong. The plane landed, and I had to take a taxi to the estate. My apologies to you and your husband for the interruption." He spoke with a quiet politeness that was almost more towering than if he had yelled. Ethan, still standing at the podium, felt a cold sweat form on his brow. The man's simple, direct manner was unnerving. He looked completely unfazed by the opulence, by the hundreds of eyes on him. He wasn't intimidated. He was just there. And his very presence invalidated everything Ethan had just said. "This is a private event," Ethan snapped, his voice tight with humiliation. "I don't know who you are, but you have no business interrupting a private family matter." Genevieve turned to her husband, her eyes wide. "Ethan, this is my father, Patrick. I told you he was coming." Ethan's mind raced. He had dismissed Genevieve's mention of her father's visit. He had assumed Patrick O'Connor was a man who lived a quiet life, a man who wouldn't dare step foot into his son-in-law's world of wealth and prestige. But here he was, and in a single moment he had dismantled Ethan's carefully constructed narrative. Patrick turned his attention to Ethan. He looked him up and down, a calm, assessing gaze that made Ethan feel like a bug under a microscope. "Patrick O'Connor," he said, extending his hand, "and I believe you just publicly humiliated my daughter, a beautiful girl who, I might add, deserves nothing but love and respect." Ethan, too, stunned to refuse, shook the man's hand. The grip was firm and honest. "I was simply stating the truth," he retorted, trying to regain his footing. "Your daughter is a lovely woman, but we come from two very different worlds. She is not built for this life." Patrick let out a soft, almost pitying chuckle. He looked around the ballroom, taking in the chandeliers, the marble floors, the perfectly dressed guests. "This life?" he said, his voice laced with an irony that was completely lost on Ethan. "A life of fancy parties and speeches full of thinly veiled contempt. That's not a life, son. That's a stage. And a very poorly managed one at that." The whispers in the crowd had ceased. Everyone was hanging on Patrick's every word. Vincent Caldwell looked on with a strange mix of recognition and curiosity. Bridget Montgomery had put away her pen and notepad, her usual predatory smile replaced by an expression of genuine confusion. "I apologize again for interrupting your little performance," Patrick continued, his voice still low and even. "But when a man stands up and talks about my daughter as if she were a piece of property, a project to be molded, I believe I have the right to interject." Ethan's face was a mask of furious red. "You have no right here. Who do you think you are?" "Patrick." O'Connor's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. He patted Genevieve's hand and looked out at the assembled guests. "It's a fair question," he said. "Who do I think I am? For the past 10 years, I've been content to be known as Genevieve's father. But perhaps for clarity's sake, it's time to be a little more specific." He turned back to Ethan. "I believe you're a man who deals in numbers, son. Cold, hard facts. Well, let me give you a few." He reached into the inner pocket of his worn tweed jacket and pulled out a small, unassuming black leather folder. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his hand, a silent but powerful prop. "You mentioned my daughter's humble beginnings," Patrick said, his voice still quiet, but now with an undeniable edge. "You said I live in a glorified shed. You're not wrong. I do live in a cabin on a very large piece of land. But I own the land, not just the 50 acres where the cabin sits, but thousands of acres around it. Land I bought with the money from a patent I sold a long, long time ago. A patent for a certain type of high-efficiency engine that powers a very popular line of luxury sports cars." A wave of speculation went through the crowd. Vincent Caldwell's eyes widened. He knew of that patent. It had been the cornerstone of a massive automotive empire, a secret that had made its anonymous inventor a fortune in the late 90s. But no one had ever known who the man was. "That's a nice little story," Ethan sneered, though the confidence in his voice was beginning to waver. "But it doesn't change anything. You're still just a man in an old jacket." Patrick let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Just a man. Son, you have no idea. The patent was a good start. But you know what a man does with a good start. He invests, quietly, discreetly. I bought up land, sure, but I also invested in a little-known tech company back in the early 2000s. A company whose software now runs the entire logistics chain for, I don't know, a certain global shipping giant. A company that you, Mr. Carlyle, have been trying to acquire for the last 2 years, only to have your bids mysteriously rebuffed. Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. He had spent months trying to acquire that logistics company, an elusive target with a single anonymous majority shareholder who refused to sell. He had even sent his top negotiators to track down the man, but they had always returned empty-handed. Could it be? And then there's the art gallery, Patrick said, turning his gaze to the crowd. You said my daughter worked at a simple art gallery. You are correct. It was simple. It was also the first and only gallery to showcase the works of a certain reclusive artist who goes by the name P. O'Connor. Another wave of whispers. Bridget Montgomery gasped aloud. The name was synonymous with modern art genius. P. O'Connor paintings known for their raw emotional power and anonymous origin sold for millions at auction. No one had ever seen the man, but everyone knew his work. Patrick finally opened the folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to Ethan. It was a certified bank statement, not just a statement but a balance sheet of a holding company. Ethan's eyes scanned the numbers, and the world seemed to stop. The number at the bottom was not in the millions, it was in the tens of billions. The paper crinkled in his hand. He looked at the name on the account, O'Connor Holdings. Patrick. O'Connor took the paper back, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned to Genevieve and took her hand again, his voice now gentle and full of love. My daughter's humble beginnings, as you so arrogantly put it, were not born of necessity but of choice. I raised her to know the value of an honest day's work, to understand that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in character. I have always taught her that a good heart is worth more than $1 billion empire. And she, unlike you, never forgot that lesson. The crowd stared in disbelief. Vincent Caldwell's jaw was on the floor. Bridget Montgomery looked like she had seen a ghost. Ethan Carlyle, the self-made billionaire, was now just a man standing on a stage, his carefully constructed facade of success and power completely and utterly shattered by a man in an old tweed jacket. The humiliation was no longer his to inflict. It was his to bear. And the night was only just getting started. The silence in the ballroom was profound, a physical weight pressing down on every single person. The information Patrick had just dropped was a bombshell that had not only detonated Ethan's carefully planned evening, but had also rewritten the entire social hierarchy of their world. For a decade, Ethan Carlyle had been the undisputed king, a man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps and built an empire from scratch. Now it seemed his empire wasn't his at all, but a castle built on sand. Ethan's mind was in a state of chaotic disbelief. He looked at Patrick, then at Genevieve, then back at Patrick as if trying to reconcile the simple man standing before him with the multi-billionaire he had just described. The numbers on that bank statement, the companies Patrick had mentioned, it was all real. He had spent countless hours and millions of dollars trying to acquire that elusive logistics firm, a key component to his grand expansion plan. And the anonymous owner, the man he had never been able to find, was his father-in-law. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. You are P. O'Connor. Ethan finally managed to stammer his voice a pathetic croak. Patrick smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile, full of a kind of wisdom that Ethan could only pretend to possess. "Among other things," he said, "the art was a hobby. I never cared for the attention. That's why I chose to be anonymous. And the engine patent, well, I was just a young man with an idea. The money was a happy coincidence." He turned to Genevieve, who was still holding his hand, her face a mix of emotions, relief, sorrow, and a quiet, weary resolve. "I gave Genevieve the option," Patrick said, addressing the stunned crowd, his voice still calm and steady. "I could have given her the world. A trust fund, a foundation in her name, a life of effortless luxury. But she chose a different path. She chose to live simply, to work for a cause she believed in, to find her own way in the world. She chose to be a woman of substance, not a woman of spectacle." Ethan felt a suffocating sense of shame. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own arrogance and his obsession with appearances, that he had completely misjudged the woman he had been married to for 10 years. He had seen her lack of ambition as a flaw, her simplicity as a sign of her low status. He had never once considered that it was a choice, a deliberate act of character. "And you, Mr. Carlyle," Patrick said, turning his gaze back to Ethan, the warmth in his voice evaporating, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp edge. "You were meant to be the test. You were a man of the world, a man of power. I thought perhaps he will see her for who she truly is. He will love her for her kindness, her grace, her spirit. Not for what she can be made into, but for what she already is." He shook his head slowly, a profound disappointment etched on his face. "You failed that test, son. You failed spectacularly." The crowd began to buzz the whispers, now a frantic, excited chatter. Vincent Caldwell pushed his way to the front, his face pale. "Mr. O'Connor," he said, his voice a reverent whisper, "my firm has been trying to get in touch with you for months. The logistics company. We had no idea." Patrick nodded. "I'm sure you didn't. I prefer to keep a low profile. I don't need a publicist to tell people who I am. My assets speak for themselves, unlike some." He glanced at Ethan, a flash of pure contempt in his eyes. Now Patrick's gaze was directed solely at Ethan. "You see, son," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that nonetheless carried through the silent hall. "You've always believed you are a self-made man, that every dollar you have is a testament to your own genius. But that's where you're wrong." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a deep, primal fear, a fear that he had never known before. What else was there? What else could this man possibly take from him? "Do you know where the original funding for your family's first venture came from, Ethan?" Patrick asked a rhetorical question. "The small loan that saved your father's business from bankruptcy all those years ago. That was a quiet investment I made, an investment in a small company with a promising if unproven model. I did it because your father, God rest his soul, was a good and honest man, a man who always spoke with great pride of his son's ambition." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. It was impossible. His father had always told him the loan came from a private anonymous benefactor who had been impressed by their business plan. It was the founding myth of the Carlyle Empire, a story of a small, honest business saved by a miracle. And that miracle, it turned out, was his wife's father. And do you know why your company's stock has never crashed, even through 2 major market downturns? Patrick continued, his voice relentless. "Because I've been a quiet, discreet majority shareholder in your firm For years, propping up your stock prices, making sure your empire never crumbled. I did it for Genevieve's sake. I wanted to protect her and her future, just in case you in your arrogance ran your company into the ground. The final blow. Ethan's legs felt weak. His entire life, his entire fortune, his entire identity as a self-made man was a lie. He was not a titan of industry. He was a protégé, a puppet on a string, a man whose success had been quietly and secretly engineered by the very man he had just publicly humiliated. Genevieve, her hand still in her father's, looked at her husband with a mixture of pity and sorrow. She had always known. She had known that her father, a man of quiet substance, had been the silent force behind Ethan's public spectacle. She had watched for a decade as Ethan had mocked her for her roots, all while being completely dependent on those very same roots for his success. Patrick O'Connor looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the horrified, stunned faces of the elite. "Now," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Who's the simple one? The one who lives by his word and his deeds, or the one who built a house of cards and had the audacity to call it a mansion?" He took Genevieve's arm and gently led her away from the podium, leaving Ethan standing alone in the center of his own wreckage. The crowd parted for them, their whispers now reverent, not pitying. Ethan watched them go, his chest heaving, his mind in a state of utter overwhelming shock. He had started the night as the king of his universe. He was now in front of everyone who mattered a fraud, and the true architect of his life's work was the man he had just tried to shame. The gala dissolved into a maelstrom of confusion and frantic whispers. Guests began to leave in a hurry, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and a certain ghoulish fascination. The air, once filled with the celebratory clinking of glasses, now hummed with the electric current of scandal. Vincent Caldwell, looking like he had just witnessed a ghost, approached Ethan, but Ethan waved him away. His mind was a white-hot furnace of denial and panic. He had to get out of there. He had to be alone. He walked off the stage, his steps unsteady, his carefully maintained composure gone. He moved through the thinning crowd like a phantom, oblivious to the stares, the pitying looks, the hushed conversations. He didn't stop until he reached his private study, a room he had always considered his sanctuary. He slammed the heavy oak door shut and locked it, plunging the room into a deep, disquieting silence. He stared at the objects in the room, symbols of his success. The signed first edition of a financial treatise, the model of a yacht. He was building a photograph of him on the cover of a magazine, a title blaring Ethan Carlyle, The Midas Touch. He had always believed in the truth of that title. He had always believed he could turn anything he touched into gold. But tonight, that belief had been brutally, publicly, and irrevocably shattered. The Midas touch wasn't his. It was Patrick's. All of it. The original seed money, the quiet protection of his stock, the unobtainable logistics company that would have been the jewel in his crown. It was all under the control of the man he had dismissed as a simple country farmer. The irony was a poison in his veins. He had shamed his wife for her humble background, never realizing that her roots were not a source of poverty, but a fountain of unimaginable wealth and quiet power. He had been a fool, an arrogant, short-sighted, and pathetic fool. A knock on the door jolted him. "Ethan, it's me. Vincent." Ethan ignored him. He didn't want to see anyone. He wanted to disappear. He walked to the window and stared out at the sprawling, perfectly manicured grounds. All of it was a lie. His success was an illusion, a magnificent facade built on a foundation he had never even known existed. Another more insistent knock. "Ethan, it's Genevieve. Please open the door. We need to talk." Genevieve, the woman he had just eviscerated in front of everyone. The woman who had known the truth all along. A new wave of shame washed over him. He had belittled her, called her simple, and mocked her for being a project. All the while she had been protecting him, living a quiet life that was a testament to her character, not her lack of ambition. The truth was a scalding, bitter pill. He had never been a self-made man. He was a child, propped up and protected by a patriarch he didn't even know existed. He had built his entire identity on a lie. He was a fraud. He heard the lock click and the door swing open. Genevieve and her father stood there. They didn't rush in. They stood in the doorway, their faces a mix of sorrow and resolve. "I need some time to process this," Ethan said, his voice raw. "You don't have time," Patrick said, his voice still that low, measured rumble. "The reporters are already calling. Your board members are calling. Your world is crumbling, son, and it's time to decide what you want to do about it." Genevieve walked into the room, her eyes never leaving his. She was no longer the humiliated wife. She was a woman who had been tested and had passed with flying colors. "Why, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an unwavering clarity. "Why was it so important to you that I be something I'm not? Why couldn't you just accept me? Was I so terrible? Was my quietness so offensive?" He looked at her truly. Looked at her for the first time in years. Her face, her simple dress, her unassuming grace. He had been so blind. I just wanted us to be a perfect match," he said, the words a hollow echo of his long-held delusion. "I worked so hard for everything. I wanted my wife to be a testament to that success." Genevieve let out a small, mirthless laugh. "A testament to your success, Ethan? I was your partner. I was the one who encouraged you to take that risk with the European market. I was the one who went through your reports and found the discrepancy in the shipping manifests. I was the one who convinced you to donate to the children's charity, the one that ended up getting you that Humanitarian of the Year award." Ethan's jaw dropped. She was right. She had been a sounding board, a quiet, intelligent force in his life. He had dismissed her contributions, attributing her insights to luck or coincidence. "You never saw me as a person," Genevieve said, her voice full of a sorrow that cut him deeper than any insult. "You saw me as a role, the trophy wife, the accessory. My father knew that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in who you are. He gave me the choice to live that truth. I chose to be a woman of substance. You chose to be a man of spectacle." Patrick walked further into the room and closed the door behind him. "The truth is, son," he said, his voice now devoid of any pretense. "You have a choice. You can let the world find out the full extent of the truth, that your empire is a house of cards, and that you are not the genius you have led everyone to believe you are. Or you can start over. Really start over." Ethan looked at him, his mind reeling. "Start over? What do you mean?" "I'll sell you the logistics company," Patrick said, a glint in his eye, "at a fair market price, and I will keep my role as a silent investor in your firm. But there are conditions." Ethan's heart began to beat with a frantic, desperate hope. "What conditions?" "First, you get down on your knees and apologize to my daughter. Sincerely. Not for public show, but from the depths of your soul. You have to earn back her respect, not with money, but with genuine remorse." Ethan looked at Genevieve, his eyes full of a plea for forgiveness. She simply watched him, a silent, unblinking witness to his downfall. "Second," Patrick continued, "you will work for me, for a year. You will not be Ethan Carlyle, CEO. You will be an associate. You will work on the ground in the field. You will learn what it means to build something with your own two hands, with integrity and hard work. You will learn the difference between a real asset and a paper asset." Ethan's head snapped up. "Work for you? You're a farmer and a painter." Patrick let out a genuine, booming laugh. "And an engineer, a tech investor, a real estate mogul, and a man who knows the value of an honest dollar. Don't be fooled by the tweed jacket, son. It's a lot warmer than a hollow suit. You will work for me, and you will learn to be a man of substance. And if you pass my test, if you prove that you have a character worth a damn, then we can talk about the future. For you and for my daughter." He looked at Genevieve, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slowly. This was her decision, her quiet path to redemption for a decade of public ridicule. Ethan looked from Patrick to Genevieve, and for the first time he saw them not as his wife and his father-in-law, but as two powerful, unwavering forces. He saw the truth, the whole unvarnished truth. He could choose to fight, to cling to his broken identity, and watch his empire collapse around him. Or he could choose to humble himself, to start over, and to maybe, just maybe, become the man he had always pretended to be. The decision, the most important of his life, was now his to make. The gala, a stage for public spectacle, had dissolved into a maelstrom of confusion. Guests fled their faces, a mix of shock and morbid fascination. Ethan walked through the thinning crowd like a phantom, oblivious to the stares, and locked himself in his private study, a sanctuary now filled with hollow symbols of his success. He stared at a magazine cover, bearing his face titled, "Ethan Carlyle, the Midas Touch." The words now mocked him. The Midas touch wasn't his. It was Patrick's, all of it. The original seed money, the quiet protection of his stock, the unobtainable logistics company. His empire was a lie. A knock on the door jolted him. It was Genevieve and her father. He couldn't face them. "I need time to process this," Ethan said, his voice raw. "You don't have time." Patrick's voice was a low, steady rumble. "The reporters are already calling. Your world is crumbling, and it's time to decide what you want to do." Genevieve walked, in her eyes clear and unwavering. "Why, Ethan? Why was it so important that I be something I'm not? Was my quietness so offensive?" He looked up, unable to lie. "I just wanted us to be a perfect match. I worked so hard for everything. I wanted my wife to be a testament to that success." Genevieve let out a small, mirthless laugh. "A testament to your success, Ethan? I was your partner. I was the one who encouraged you to take that risk with the European market. I was the one who found the discrepancy in your shipping reports. You saw me as a role, the trophy wife. But I was never a project. I was a person." The weight of her words was immense. He had dismissed her contributions, attributing her insights to luck. All the while she had been a quiet, intelligent force in his life. He was the coward afraid people would see the cracks in his perfect facade, so he tried to make her a scapegoat for his own insecurities. Patrick stepped in, closing the door behind him. "You have a choice, son. You can let the world find out the full truth that your empire is a house of cards, or you can start over. Really start over." A desperate hope flared in Ethan. "Start over. What do you mean?" "I'll sell you the logistics company at a fair price," Patrick said. and I will remain a silent investor in your firm. But there are conditions." "What conditions?" "First, you apologize to my daughter, sincerely, not for public show, but from the depths of your soul. You have to earn back her respect." Ethan looked at Genevieve, his eyes filled with a plea for forgiveness. She watched him, a silent, unblinking witness to his downfall. "Second," Patrick continued, "you will work for me. For a year. You will not be Ethan Carlisle, CEO. You will be an associate. You will learn to build something with your own two hands, with integrity and hard work. You will learn the difference between a real asset and a paper asset." Ethan's head snapped up. "Work for you. A farmer and a painter." Patrick laughed, a genuine, booming sound. "And an engineer, a tech investor, a real estate mogul. Don't be fooled by the tweed jacket, son. It's a lot warmer than a hollow suit. You will work for me, and you will learn to be a man of substance. And if you pass my test, we can talk about the future." He looked at Genevieve, and she nodded slowly. This was her decision, her path to redemption, for a decade of ridicule. Ethan looked from Patrick to Genevieve, finally seeing them as two powerful, unwavering forces. He could fight, cling to his broken identity, and watch his empire collapse. Or he could humble himself, start over, and perhaps become the man he had always pretended to be. He had no choice. "I understand, sir," Ethan said. "Good. The car is leaving at dawn. Be ready." Patrick left, leaving Ethan and Genevieve alone. The silence was different now. It was no longer a chasm, but a bridge. Ethan walked over to Genevieve, not touching her. He just stood looking at her, seeing her for the first time as the person she truly was. A woman of immense strength and grace. He had spent a decade looking for a trophy, and had failed to see the treasure he had already found. "I have a lot to make up for," Ethan said, his voice laced with newfound humility. "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Someday." Genevieve gave a small, sad smile. "Forgiveness is a journey, Ethan. We'll see where it leads." She walked to the other side of the room, preparing for the long night. Ethan stood there, looking at the woman he had wronged, who had always been a rock in the storm he created. He had lost everything, but in that loss he had a chance to find something infinitely more valuable. The journey had just begun. The first few months were a brutal lesson in humility for Ethan Carlisle. The man who had lived his life in designer suits now wore jeans and work boots. He traded his private jet for a beat-up Ford pickup, and his mahogany desk for a plot of land with his father-in-law, Patrick. Ethan's days were now spent in physical labor, his hands covered in calluses, his body aching from work he had never known. He was no longer a CEO. He was an apprentice, learning the true value of a tree of the land and of the people who worked it. Patrick. The man Ethan had once dismissed as a simple farmer was a master teacher. He didn't just teach Ethan about timber and land management. He taught him about life. He spoke of integrity, of earning respect, and of the quiet satisfaction of seeing a tangible result of his own labor. Ethan's home was no longer the silent, lonely suite, but a rustic cabin with a wood-burning fireplace. He and Genevieve spoke every night, their conversations shifting from business to the small details of their lives. He would tell her about the satisfaction of felling a difficult tree, and she would tell him about her work at the community center. He was finally talking to her as a person, not as a symbol. He was beginning to fall in love with her all over again, not with the idea of her, but with the reality of who she was. After 6 months, Patrick brought him to a modest old office building. Ethan expected a desk, but instead he was introduced to a man behind a simple wooden desk, Vincent Caldwell. "Vincent," Ethan said, stunned. "What are you doing here?" Vincent shook his hand. "Patrick offered me a partnership. Turns out he has a few more assets than I thought." He gestured to a whiteboard covered in names of companies Ethan had tried and failed to acquire over the years. Companies that had mysteriously and repeatedly rebuffed his offers. Patrick had been the owner all along. The man he had mocked was a business genius of a completely different order. Patrick built things grew, things invested in things that mattered. He wasn't a spectacle. He was a force of nature. A full, grueling, humbling year passed. Ethan had worked harder than he ever had in his life. He had learned the true value of an honest dollar, a word, and a handshake. The arrogance had been replaced by a quiet confidence. The hollowness had been filled with a genuine purpose. On the anniversary of his test, Patrick and Genevieve came to the cabin. Genevieve was in a simple dress, her hair in a single braid. She looked more beautiful to him now than she ever had in all the diamonds and silk of their previous life. "You've earned my respect, son," Patrick said, a rare warmth in his voice. "And my trust." He handed Ethan a manila folder. "This is a contract, a partnership, and a marriage license." Ethan looked at the documents, his heart pounding. The partnership was a new venture, combining his business acumen with Patrick's wisdom. The marriage license was a promise of a new beginning, a chance for him to truly marry Genevieve, not for her appearance, but for her character. Ethan turned to Genevieve, his eyes filled with a new love and deep respect. He didn't need a public statement or a grand gesture. He just needed to be a man worthy of her. "Genevieve," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I spent a decade trying to turn you into something you're not, and I almost lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm not the man you married, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." Genevieve's eyes filled with tears, and she walked into his arms, a quiet act of forgiveness, more powerful than any public declaration. The ring was gone, but the love in her heart was real. The man she had married was gone, but the man before her was one she could truly love. A man of substance, not of spectacle. The quiet, broken billionaire had finally found what he was looking for, not in the money he had always chased, but in the love he had almost lost forever. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollar signs or public accolades. It's found in the quiet, unassuming grace of people like Genevieve, and in the wisdom of those who, like Patrick, have built their empires on a foundation of character and integrity. The billionaire's shame wasn't the loss of his reputation, but the revelation that his entire life was a performance. His redemption wasn't in reclaiming his fortune, but in discovering a different, more meaningful kind of wealth, one built on humility, hard work, and the unwavering love of the woman he almost lost. If you were moved by this story, if it made you think about what truly matters, then hit that like button. Share this with a friend who needs a powerful dose of reality. And for more real-life stories about drama redemption and life-changing moments, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep these stories coming. Thank you for listening.